So like, are you willing to provide a general biography of your life, like what your childhood was like and what role you had in Atlantis and Egypt?
Yes, my childhood was mostly consistent of learning from other people, from my own kind, if you wish. Again, we planetary body of Mars. There was a lot of education before we readjusted. There was also the conflict that involved the destruction of some planetary body nearby us, now scattered in the solar system. That was somewhat conflicting and interesting at the same time. However, that was before I then was selected to go to your planetary body to some degree on your Atlantean year for a longer period of, again, what you would consider time frame. It was my job there to also be what you now have referred to earlier as record keeping. However, at that point, I already had a certain education that happened on your planetary body of Mars that prepared me for having an idea of having an interaction and an interspecies communication that otherwise would not have been possible, which is also somewhat helpful now to relate concepts to your kind as I'm doing now, which otherwise would like to be even more confusing to you because learning a certain literal language is one thing, but learning a certain thinking of a different species is entirely different. Even if you understand the language, you likely still wouldn't understand anything if you don't understand the thinking, for example, in reptiles or in the felines, or again, my kind or your kind, and many others out there have a completely different concept of how reality functions, what matters and what matters not, etc. That was essentially what I was being taught in this, again, what you would consider partial lifetime, if you wish, etc. Again, 1,000 year time frame. Then on the Atlantean period, I was kind of like a priest or a teacher, if you will, to many beings. I was not a ruler in terms of military power or economic power, or anything you refer to such now in your world. But in that function, I still had a certain level of influence due to my role of being a teacher and overseer, and I was untouchable by some in the idea they could not trespass or step upon my rulership in certain scientific endeavors, etc. I had a certain freedom there, and likely that was also intentional to continue on. And then, of course, there's also the idea that many of your teachings and ideas about that content got mixed up with other concepts and ideas, etc., etc. But from there on, I relocated, and I was also traveling to Egyptian region, as you're calling such now, which is much bigger than what you might believe in according to your official history, which also existed prior to the thinking.
Okay. So why did the Egyptians consider you to be the god of wisdom?
Well, obviously, I was as a shared teacher or a priest-like function. I continued to have that role in this region as well. I had all of this knowledge I learned from either my kind and also, of course, from interacting with your kind on there. And somebody in this culture simply had to have that certain function. That wasn't just me, others of my kind as well. Just later get lumped on, often likely on my person, but there were others of my kind who had similar roles, but more or less they were all of a similar nature, of a similar species, if you will, a similar look, etc. So we were all more or less the teachers of the earlier human settlers there, and we had a certain role there. We did not necessarily interrelate to them the same way some other species and people did that had a more human outlook themselves, some other words, but we still had the teaching function. We were, again, record keepers and also, of course, then the relator of those concepts, just like I'm doing to you right now.
Right. So what were your experiences during the actual sinking of Atlantis?
It was somewhat unpleasant. I wouldn't consider it necessarily outright traumatic, but it bordered on that concept. It wasn't the idea that the horrible catastrophe was not to be foreseeable. It was still unpleasant to see a lot of wisdom and build up being wasted.
Right. So I mean, did you personally, get on a ship and evacuate before the sinking happened, or were you on the
Yes.
island? Okay.
I was not threatened. I got off the island because it was obvious that something was coming, not certain what, but we foresee something happened. So I got off there before the catastrophe happened. It wasn't certain how it would happen, but I was close enough to witness it.
Okay, so you saw the actual sinking with your own eyes?
if you wish, yes, from a ship, not necessarily with the eyes, to something like you would consider a lens, but nonetheless not from far away.
Okay. Did the sinking happen like during the daytime or at nighttime?
It took a longer period of time, but it was like in the evening hours, but it was more day than night.
Okay. Um,
But
well,
yes, it wasn't like an immediate catastrophe and everything was just gone. Different islands sank, different parts broke off, so it took a longer period of what you would call time during the course.
okay. Did you have any involvement in the war with Athens that led up to the sinking of Atlantis?
Again, I attempted trying to stay neutral of what you're calling there, but it wasn't entirely possible. I was also worried about the being thrown into the conflict. My idea was more record keeping in this case too, and got to keeping the possibility of having still the the teaching function, etc. So I perhaps sided more with the idea of keeping Atlantis intact, obviously, and whatever faction want to have it down. So not necessarily with the Essence faction in this case. However, first and foremost, I did not actively participate with a weapon in my hand, etc. I did more to like have a diplomatic function to keep things intact while they're being destroyed.
Okay. No, like Metax had tried to explain to me, how your incarnation as thought is related to the Greek human-like being Hermes. But I mean, can you try to explain it to me in your own words, like how you're related to that person?
It is very likely that there was also a lumping on of different people that later came and had similar function, but may have more for human nature that tried to replace us in terms of an avian function. So some of my characteristics were also projected onto other people that try to fulfill the same role. And in some way, then you could say it's the same person, but actually, I was never human-like in such a function.
Okay, but I mean, like the Hermes person that physically lived, was he like another incarnation of you, like like your higher self created Thoth and Hermes?
That's one possibility to see it again. Past, present, future lifetime. You remember?
Right. Okay. Um, all right, well, like to shift over to another topic,
Yes.
I'm trying to create a detailed map of Atlantis. Um, and I drew a map recently that the person you're speaking through looked at. Are you able to see that map in his mind?
Yes, the Atlantis continent was more northern located. That's the first thing.
Okay. Um, yeah, well, speaking of that, kind of like I guess like a starting, like a reference point for us to go by. Like today and well, in the past too, obviously, like there were the three tectonic plates that met kind of like in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. So like that one point where like the three meet, like was that kind of like the way I drew it is like it's more towards the northern side of the island. Was that more like in the center of the island or towards the south of the island or what?
Yes, more the south than the center, but close to the center.
Okay. Um, so like the main city, Atlanta, um, like the city with the rings, Kalas like mentioned, like he estimated, I think he said it was like 35 kilometers from the coast. Is that correct?
Somewhat accurate enough, yes.
Okay.
Depends entirely how far you would still consider the city with what you would today call suburbs, etc. 35, probably 30, yes.
Okay. And like the GPS coordinates that Kalas gave, like it shows it like a little bit above, like a little bit to the north of where the three plates met. And like I'm wondering like if I redraw it, like if I push the entire island north, and it seems like the main city Atlanta is going to be like almost at the center of the island. Um, I don't.
Yes,
So was the city Atlanta kind of at the center of the island or what?
yes.
So, but I mean,
It's likely also a reason it's split apart.
uh, But like, I'm confused. Like, if Atlanta was like 35 kilometers from the coast, then I mean, if I draw it in the center of the island, it's going to be like hundreds of miles from the coast.
In the middle, in terms of like north and south, not in west and east.
So like, how far was the west coast of Atlantis to Atlanta?
The west coast of the bordering now the sea between what you would consider your current country was likely approximately 20 to 30 kilometers.
Okay. Um, so do you see like towards the southwest where I drew like a river leading from the mountains towards the city Atlantita? Like that's based on like something that Calas mentioned to me. Does that look accurate? Does that need to be adjusted?
If you moved into Ireland North, then yes,
Okay.
that was like right on the ocean.
Uh, wait, what do you mean it was right on the ocean?
A harbor.
Okay. Um,
There was also like in terms of like a river, there was more like a river bank. It's more
you mean
a bay,
a what?
a bay.
Oh, a bay. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, did you mean like the city Atlantita was more closer to the ocean rather than a bay?
Yes.
Okay. Um, no, like if you look towards like the northeast part, like the top right part of the map where I drew the current locations of like Spain and Portugal and France and the United Kingdom with dots, and then like in a much heavier line, I drew like where I'm basically just guessing where the coastline of Europe was like shortly before the sinking. And like the reason for that is because like today, the sea floor is like pretty shallow, and then it drops like all of a sudden, like right where I drew this line. So like, I was assuming that like before the sinking, like maybe that was all above water, and that was before like the ice caps melted. So like I was assuming that was, that's where the coastline of Europe was, and like the same for Africa. Like I pushed it out a little bit further from where it is today. Is that correct, or like were the coastlines of Africa and Europe much closer to where they are today?
You're somewhat correct. Maybe not exactly where you drew the line, but the idea is correct. And the Ireland idea was part of what you consider Atlantis.
Do you mean like it was physically connected to it, or do you mean it was just part of the Atlantean state?
Both.
Okay,
There
so
was some physical connection, like a land bridge, and it was considered territory.
okay, so like where I like towards the northeast part of Atlantis, I drew like kind of like a peninsula. Is that correct? And then like there was a land bridge connecting that peninsula to the land area, the land part of Europe.
Yes, the idea is correct, but not necessarily locality exactly.
So should it be pushed further north or what?
Yes.
Okay. And class mentioned like there was a city named Basileia, kind of like somewhat on Atlantis. Like half of it was on like mainland Atlantis, and like another half of it was on like an island, if I understood him correctly. Uh, is like where I have the location of Basileia, is that correct?
More in the English Channel.
Uh, so the city Basileia was like on the mainland part of Europe.
In the English Channel, so yes and no, more the idea further up Britannia.
Oh, Britannia. Okay. Um, so as you might see, like
Somewhat, yes.
okay, so like I drew a river like through what today is the English Channel. Like the reason I drew that is I assume that like before the ice caps melted and the sea level was a lot lower, like that area would have still been would have had a low elevation. So it seems like there was probably a river through there. Is that correct?
Yes, a valley with a river or several rivers.
Okay. No, like the Pillars of Hercules.
Yes,
Where I drew that on the map, is that correct?
correct.
Okay. Um, 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 um,
There were also some construction on there,
is some what do you mean construction?
artificial construction to patrol to like control the channel there.
Okay. Yeah, speaking of like well like the channel leading to the Mediterranean Sea, like before Atlantis sank and the ice caps melted somewhat, was the Mediterranean Sea a lot smaller, a lot thinner than it
There
is
was
today?
more land there and less sea, yes.
Okay. What about the mountains that I drew on the map? Is that accurate at all? The mountains and the hills?
They were bigger some and others were smaller. They weren't all like on a similar height,
Okay.
but the generality is somewhat accurate. Somewhat.
Okay. Now, like, I'm confused about this idea of a land bridge. Like, that Kalask mentioned, you said there was one like going up towards Greenland, or like one, I don't know, maybe meant that there were a few going up towards Greenland and then like one or
Yes.
a few going towards the United States.
Yes.
Um, thicker. Okay.
Thicker and not necessarily same everywhere, not necessarily all connected, more islands. As a reference point between your Bering Strait
Yeah, yeah. Okay.
comparable.
So was it kind of like there were a bunch of islands that were pretty much in a straight line and then somebody like artificially put land in between the islands to create a land bridge?
Terraforming, yes.
Okay. So was it one land bridge going up towards the north like I drew on the map? Well, I know like
Somewhat.
yeah, like you had already mentioned that I need to add another one going towards like the English Channel, but yeah, like a little bit north of the city Atlanta was
Yes.
there just one?
There were like branches of a tree, but there was one main branch, so to speak.
Okay. And then like how many were connecting the mainland Atlantis like going towards North America?
Some were going the direction, but not fully reaching it. Some were transversable and then were terraformed.
Okay.
At least two had a connection.
Okay. Um,
Perhaps more your Canadian country than your current one.
okay. I'm trying to look at my list of questions to see if there's anything else about the map I want to ask you. Um, well, I mean, like, there's a million questions I could ask. Like, I wanted to ask, like, where were the major roads? Where were the forests and everything? But I mean, I'm kind of running out of time, so I want to move on to another topic. But like, I guess one last question about the map. Like, were there any big lakes on mainland Atlantis that you would recommend I include in a future map?
Yes, further up north there was one located between two cities that you drew in. Somewhere in the center.
Okay.
It was somewhat L-shaped or boomerang shaped.
Okay. Was the main river that I drew, was that connected to it?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, like before I go on to another topic, David probably needs to drink some water. Like, do
Yes.
you know how to do that?
One moment. I will.
Okay.
That was hopefully correct.
Okay. Yeah. So like I mentioned last time, how like I was reading a book about the Emerald tablets that you mentioned earlier, and like the book it was supposedly created by a guy named Dorial who was like some brotherhood who said that like I think he said like he personally translated the Emerald tablets from you and then he had to return them to Egypt. And like there's 15 tablets that were transcribed and like I read the first five and then like I just stopped reading it because like everything seemed totally inaccurate. Like it said Atlantis sank 50,000 years ago and then it said like you personally founded Egypt and built the pyramids after Atlantis sank. And it says like your physical body is located in an underground place called the Halls of Amenti, where like some kind of energy from the planet like passes through your body and keeps your body alive while you have like other incarnations elsewhere, which like he says that's how the Hermes person was born. But I mean, like even what we were talking about today, like the stuff you told me, like about your past, your childhood goes against what this book says about you. So I mean, yeah, like does this book sound like it's just totally fake, just totally made up to you?
Not entirely. The last part was somewhat accurate in terms of the incarnation with the body in stasis or the Burmese person. It is not entirely incorrect. So the person that wrote those ideas likely had some telepathic abilities, but it didn't literally translate from tablets. They might have a good intention. I don't see necessarily a hostility in there, but it's likely to a large degree forgery,
Okay.
or at
Um,
least some fraudulent influences.
okay. So is there any such thing as as like what he calls the halls of Amenti, where it's kind of like he describes it where like you go into the tallest pyramid in Egypt, and then there's a chamber leading down. And like I don't know the way he describes it, it sounds like
Yes.
you get to a certain point in the pyramid, and then you kind of teleport or something like to some place in the inner Earth, like that he calls the halls of Amenti, where like the life energy of the planet is focused into this one spot, and like if you sit in that spot, then you can kind of live forever, and then like have different, be in a state of stasis and like incarnate into different bodies. So like, does this hall of Amenti, does that exist?
Yes. Yes, it does, but you don't necessarily need to go to a physical place.
Okay,
So those halls exist, yes, but it's not necessarily what this person describes it to be,
okay,
and you don't need to go to a pyramid to get there.
okay.
But
Um,
pyramids have a certain influence on you when you're in there. That is also true.
right. Yeah, I talked about that a lot with Kalask. Uh,
Yes.
yeah, and so like this person who wrote, this book, he says that like whenever Atlantis was sinking, you were on his ship, and like there was some temple like at the top of a mountain where you learned, like where you were taught by kind of like your intellectual master or whatever the word would be. And then like that person decided to stay in the temple and kind of like go down with the ship, so to speak. And he says like you were watching as like the mountain and the temple itself like slowly sank further and further, like, until it disappeared into the ocean. Is that accurate at all?
I watched Mountain sink from the ship, yes. Not exactly certain what other person he's referring to. There were numerous persons that could refer to one way or the other.
Okay, but like, was there one particular temple that you studied in, like whenever you were younger, that you watched go down?
Well, younger, not a child anymore, but yes, there were numerous temples and some that were perhaps more precious or dear to me, yes, that I've watched sinking, but it's not like that was large loss. It's more the idea of knowledge that was of concern of mine, and much had been evacuated from there in time, so it was just a beautiful architecture that was lost.
Okay,
And there were numerous ones, yes, not necessarily one that I was staring at intensely or something. Again, this information too is not entirely inaccurate, but it's not entirely accurate either.
okay,
There's
um,
perhaps an emotional projection onto me that the person misinterpreted.
right. Now like the books that Plato wrote about Atlantis, like in it he says that the Poseidon or Enki person, whatever name you want to give to him, like he had 10 male children, and like he divided the main island of Atlantis into ten different kingdoms or zones or sections or whatever word you want to give it. And then he gave his oldest son Atlas, like since he was the oldest one, um,
The city.
yeah, he gave him like the city Atlantis and like the zone that was around the city, and then like his other nine children, he assigned the different nine zones to them, like to his younger brothers, and then they kind of like had lordship over these zones, but they were kind of like one level below the king. Is that accurate?
That is fairly accurate, yes, but they had also guardship over colonies that were linked to them, not just the direct annular area of the Atlantis continent, but also other adjacent islands and perhaps also regions at certain points of the European continent, the African continent, North American continent. However, there was also conflicts between them, which was encouraged. So some shifted over to the other and back and forth, and there was encouraged conflict, or at least competition, is perhaps a better term. And some were sometimes amassed by the other. The person had more children that were what you would today consider bastards that didn't have any rulership allowance, etc. But the general concept is accurate, yes.
Okay. So did the Enki or Poseidon person have any daughters, or was it just 10 sons?
Yes, there were also daughters, but again, illegitimate.
Okay. Um,
He certainly had daughters, yes. And he also had sexual intercourse with some.
so was he really married to like the person that we now call Plato, and that's who he had his 10 sons with?
He had sons and daughters with different women.
Okay. So was there one like I I don't know who describes it. I think it was Plato. He describes like Poseidon meeting this woman Plato on Atlantis, and then like they live together in the like that center island, like at the very center of the city Atlanta, and then like
For a while, yes.
so is that accurate? Was there a woman? I mean, I'm sure at the time her name wasn't Plato, but was there a woman who he married and they lived
He
together?
had married, at least you're calling it that way, yes.
Okay. So is it accurate that Atlas's eldest son became king whenever he died, and then the king, like this king's eldest son, took the throne after he died, and so on for many different generations?
Yes, and that eluded the bloodline, however, for many different generations, so that lately also power faded.
Okay. Um,
Because there are years the male often married a female of a different bloodline.
right. So was it kind of like their lifespan got shorter and shorter with each generation?
And certain abilities, different aspects.
Okay. Do you know how?
And also, of course, the recognition of the rulership.
Right. Do you know how many years before the sinking Atlas was first made king?
I asking is thinking, likely there were more kingship to the last, there was about 100 years after the last person was still considered king would have been in charge, as there was already the questioning of the rulership, but I cannot tell you exactly how. One moment.
Okay.
Perhaps 10,000.
Okay, you mean like 10,000 years before the island sank was when Atlas was named king?
Approximately.
Okay. Um,
Very malleable.
yeah, maybe,
I did not keep track on that exactly and remember the malleability of time. It could theoretically be a much longer period.
right. You might have just answered this and maybe I just misunderstood you, but like how many different kings were there between Atlas and when the island, when Atlantis sank?
Approximately 10 kings that were considered such. Then there are other rulers that no longer had that title, just like in the Egyptian region.
Okay. Um, so, like, what was the Poseidon or Enki person's role in the kingdom? I mean, was he the ultimate authority who was kind of a level above the king, or did he just like tell his son Atlas like, okay, you're in charge, and then he, I don't know, he just left the rulership to him and like his future descendants, or what?
Originally, he was the main ruler.
Okay. Uh,
Then later powers delegated.
okay. So like, whenever the island sank, what role did the Enki Poseidon person have?
The attempt to keep the island afloat. So more like a He was not allowed to have any contact at that point, but he still did.
Okay. Um, do you
There
know?
was also involved with the whole conflict with his father
Right, right.
and the brother.
Do you know like the name? I mean, I know that like the name Enki and Poseidon isn't the name that the person actually used at the time. Do you know what name he actually used for himself, like that he
I,
spoke with his own mouth?
I'm uncertain if there was any name what was being used in terms of referring to each other in this civilization, of names weren't used totally only to refer to humans.
Okay, so how did they, were they telepathic?
Slilang, perhaps. Slilang. However, most was telepathy, yes, correct. However, they still did communicate with human beings, so the gully, like verbally, Slilang.
I know like there's probably no English spelling of that word, but I mean, can you just so like if I want to refer to that name in the future, I mean, can you please like come up with your own English spelling of that name?
In this person's mind, Slilang, Slilang.
Okay. Cool, interesting. What about his brother, the Enlil person? Uh, do you know what name that person went by?
Halang,
And same question, can you spell it for me, please?
with an H at the beginning and an A, rest the same.
Okay. Um,
But again, those are just also terms that I'm familiar with from their own culture. I might have also used to interact with our kind,
okay.
just like you used other names to interact with your kind. And then even those names are likely distorted to then being used in different cultures.
Okay. Is it possible?
Names are not that important for beings.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, like for us, it just gives us, since we're not
I
telepathic.
understand.
Yeah. Is it possible for you to say exactly how many years passed between the sinking of Atlantis and our current year, 2021?
12, 13,000
Okay.
approximately. Again, time, malleability, understand.
Okay. Can you say, I mean, yeah, I know like time is malleable, like for the next question that I'm about to ask, but like the sinking of Mu, like, I mean, there's a bunch of different names for these islands, but like I consider like the big island in the Pacific Ocean to be called Mu, M-U, and then like the one in the Indian Ocean was Lemuria. Do you know like how long ago those two sank?
Similar time frames, somewhat earlier.
Okay.
Similar relation, similar event.
Okay. Um,
Different experiments existed on those islands.
right. Net,
Large population of it, the Asian continent.
okay. And like, the last time we talked, I mentioned to you that the reason like I think 12,900 years is like the best available estimate we have for when Atlantis sank is because like our ice records show that the temperature at that time like went up really suddenly, and then like 1,200 years later, like 11,700 years ago, the temperature went down really suddenly. And like I was talking to Metax about this, and Metax said that like the reason the temperature dropped suddenly was because there was like kind of a nuclear winter, and then it was also caused to other like technologies, like weather related technologies they were experimenting with. Anyway, like do
Yes.
you do you agree with that? Like should we, if somebody wanted to try to pinpoint like a more precise year, could we just look at our own ice records and say like just look for the time whenever the temperature drops suddenly? Like, is there a correlation between that and the sinking of Atlantis?
There's a correlation, yes. It might not be immediately, but it's if you want to have a scientific, malleable, or relatable concept, then yes.
Okay. And like,
There was weather technology involved. Yes, you would perhaps consider it HARP.
okay. So was there a what we call a nuclear winter with like dust and other things like in the atmosphere, like smoke and stuff like clouding the atmosphere for several years or many years.
Many years.
Okay.
Yes, not necessarily all over the planet to the same degree as you had in earlier time frames when certain other genetic experiments were destroyed of a non-human nature or more reptilian nature, but to a lesser degree.
What percentage of the sunlight approximately was blocked out?
13%.
Okay. Um, so do Metax mentioned that like the reason the temperature increased rapidly, like 1200 years after the temperature dropped suddenly was due to artificial cleaning of the atmosphere. Do you know like what is this? Like, do you know what he meant by that? Like, how was the atmosphere cleaned artificially?
Well, it was simply, well, not like a vacuum cleaner. That would not work that way, but there was a certain reduction. Something else was added into the atmosphere, and largely the smoke was reduced, what blocked the sunlight out mainly.
Okay.
I have a difficult time finding something relatable to explain to you what technology was being used, since your planet doesn't possess something similar, but a vacuum cleaner of a certain sort is perhaps the best way to describe it.
Okay, so why did they wait 1200 years to clean out the atmosphere? Why not do it right away?
Conflicting factions have different interests, and some factions had the interest to clean it up. It's not like there was no conflict up there what was to be done about your planet. So some faction couldn't even get there to do anything for a while.
Okay.
And some considered this actually to be a cleansing broth that's still off the planet to have this continuously.
Okay. Um, who would you consider to be the founder of ancient Egypt?
Well, I certainly took a part in it, but there wasn't just one.
Um,
Atlanteans, obviously, from what you would today call them, but it was found before the destruction of Atlantis, but after the construction.
the construction of what?
Atlantis existed, and Egypt became a colony during the existence of Atlantis before the sinking.
Okay. Um,
And yes, I played a certain role in it, in the construction, but there were several. I wouldn't name one person.
um, so can you say how many years before the sinking of Atlantis it was founded?
That's somewhat difficult to pinpoint, depending on what you would consider the original construction. It's not like the entire civilization rose out of nothing as soon as you would consider it Egypt. Also, many thousands of years ago, before the sinking, there were already some settlements.
Okay. Who ordered the construction of the three main pyramids at Giza and why?
That was already, well, a much later point, when it was still before the sinking. I certainly had also a role in such. There were also cultural artifacts and the idea of also, well, there are powerhouses to a large degree of funneling energy. Though they weren't necessarily used as tombs originally, it doesn't mean they weren't later considered as such by some.
Okay. Um, can you say how many years before the sinking of Atlantis their construction began and how many years before the sinking they were completed?
Also, thousands of years before, well, some others were also constructed much later as a copycat attempt. I think that's the term you're using. So one was constructed 1,000 years earlier.
Do you mean do you mean the construction started 1,000 years earlier or it ended 1,000 years earlier?
It's ended.
Okay. How many years did it take to complete?
hundreds.
Okay. Uh,
But again, it was done by the natives there or by people that were brought there.
so what pyramid, like out of the three main pyramids there, which one or ones were constructed before Atlantis sank and which were built after it sank?
From what I'm aware of, the Gizeh they're calling Cheops were constructed earlier.
So like the tallest pyramid, are you saying that was built before the sinking and then the next two tallest ones were built after the sinking?
Yes.
Okay. Um, so this next question might be something you're not able to talk about, but is there like a passageway that leads from like the tallest pyramid down to the inner earth?
Not vertically. But there are certainly passageways that lead underground, yes. So you could find something there, but not necessarily it leads all the way to what you could they call inner Earth.
Okay.
But cavern systems, yes.
Okay.
Certainly would be something interesting to look there if that's what you're referring.
I mean, I would love to go explore that. I mean, like, would I get killed if I tried to go into these corridors? Like, is there, I don't know, some artificial intelligence that like kills anybody who tries to wander in there?
Not necessarily artificial intelligences, but some form of like frequency radiation that could like lead you to suicidal thoughts. Not that you would immediately die instantaneously, but likely you would get very nauseous and sick.
Okay.
And could fall to a like deadly disease eventually. But might your government will likely interfere before you even get there. Depends.
Okay. Um, yeah, it seems dangerous. I don't want to, I mean, I would love to go journey into the inner earth. But yeah, I don't want to get killed.
Yes, you would likely find only cavern systems, not necessarily the inner but it might be interesting what you find in there still. But it is protected through various means. Your government has likely artificially installed some protection system to keep people from even going there. But even if you succeed, then you would likely still be inflicted by something else.
Okay. Um, was there originally a second Sphinx that faced west the way the existing one today faces east, like some people believe?
There were many,
How many?
perhaps hundreds. Many were destroyed.
Hmm. Why? How?
During thinking,
In the sinking?
yes,
So were they like close to the coast of the Mediterranean Sea?
yes, there were, and there was also more like infliction on the Egyptian area while that was going on.
Okay.
And many were also destroyed later on by rulers that didn't like the one ruler or the other, etc., etc., and some representing this or that ruler from considering the face, and they were blown up, etc. And then some of the faces were also changed, and likely the face of your current one was also changed.
Okay. Who was the ruler of Egypt at the time of Atlantis' sinking?
I don't have a name. None of your so-called pharaohs. That came much later.
Okay.
A person that likely was also related to the bloodline of the ruler of the Atlantean continent at the time, so the Atlas bloodline.
Okay. Um, and now like,
But set of the princes and kings there, you get the idea.
right. Now like Mitak said that, like the Ber- the Bermuda Triangle disappearances that we have are caused likely by some kind of experimental equipment that the Atlanteans were experimenting with, which got destroyed during the sinking and like released some kind of energy that kind of like stained the ground, somewhat similar to the Chernobyl accident. Like, is this correct? And like, if so, I mean, can you elaborate on it more? Like, what was this technology that the Atlanteans were experimenting with, and how did it create the Bermuda Triangle?
It wasn't like the Chernobyl nuclear accident, wasn't nuclear technology directly, but it certainly had a possibility to travel time and space and shift something somewhere else, perhaps also comparable more to your Philadelphia experiment. that something there happened in such a manner. So like portal technology, it was almost weaponized. More and more technologies in the end were weaponized and used in a weaponized function. So it is somewhat comparable to, if you wish, like in your today's society, what Chernobyl would be. It was an accident, yes, and created a rift in time-space, which doesn't necessarily mean if you go there something like this happens, but the possibility exists also depending with what you're going there and what exactly state you are in, etc., etc. And if you enter in that field, and then likely people that disappear there reappear somewhere else, but in a place and time where they might immediately die because they're not equipped for the environment for some reason. For example, if you travel there suddenly too hot or too cold, or the altitude, etc., depends where you end up.
Okay. Um, now, like,
It's like you accidentally walk into a portal.
okay. No, like, I told Kalaska Metax that, like, if I ever get enough money, I would like to rent some kind of submarine to go down to, like, the location, like, the GPS coordinates that Kalaska Metax gave me for where the city Atlanta was located, and, like, see if I can find evidence of, ruins like the pyramids and the ring walls and, the different buildings and stuff like that. Or, like, even if that's too expensive, like maybe like based on my current job salary, I might be able to afford something cheaper, like mapping the area with sonar, or, like sending a little robot with like a camera on it down there. But like, do you know like how much of the like basically how much of the city still exists today? Like, do the pyramids and the ring walls and buildings still exist?
Unlikely that you would find any detailed pyramidal structures. Perhaps, yes.
Okay, do you know if the ring walls are still intact enough?
Unlikely
Okay,
that you could identify them as being Atlantean, but being artificial, yes.
okay. What do you think about like me or somebody else like discovering the ruins of Atlantis and proving it existed? I mean, is that okay with you, or would you prefer for it to be kept secret?
That is of no concern to me at this point.
Okay,
It could be interesting for your civilization, of course,
right,
if you will succeed in such in publishing anything, but another question.
right. Um, are you very familiar with who the real King Arthur and Merlin were?
Not necessarily a detailed topic that I'm familiar with, but I understand some topics about it. I can also read in your planetary what you consider akashic records, etc. Some of it also in the research that's been done on your planet. I wasn't directly familiar with the person. I understand there are also numerous individuals, again, that have been identified as such, and some of them having also lived much later.
Right.
The Pendragon idea, yes.
Yeah, like the person that I would consider to be the main King Arthur person would be the one who lived with Merlin and Lancelot and Guinevere and ruled from the castle Camelot. And like Mitak said that that person lived before Atlantis sank. Um, but like he wasn't able to provide like a specific year whenever this person lived. I mean, are you able to provide a specific year whenever this person lived?
Difficult, but 1,000 years before the sinking approximately, and he was also related to the culture. Remember, not just the whole island, but also the culture of a larger what you then who they would consider the United Kingdom was also related to the Atlantean kingdom.
Okay. Uh, and like you had mentioned a minute ago that Arthur's Arthur's last name was Pendragon. Like, do you know if he or his family had any ties at all to literal flying dragons?
Energetically or even physically, yes. At least what they would call such flying dragons, reptilians on ships, yes.
Okay. Um, um, um,
Not that they were related genetically, though.
okay. Uh, do you like Metax was saying that the castle Camelot was located near what today is the island of Heligoland, like near the German coast.
Yes.
Is that correct? Do you agree with that?
Yes, correct. At the English coast server, but the island, yes.
Uh, sorry, say that again.
At the English coast, yes.
So it was closer to the English coast than where the island of Heligoland is today?
In between.
In between. Okay. And like I mentioned earlier, well, like you mentioned, there was a river that flowed through like what today is the English Channel. So like, was the castle Camelot, like was it on the edge of this river?
Not directly.
Okay. Um, well, we only have a few minutes left.
Somewhat close, yes.
Okay.